Okay, welcome back, everyone. As we continue, we'll look into ways colonial violence and justice have been and still are intertwined. In this plenary session about colonial violence and justice, we'll hear from two speakers. Please hold your questions until the end of both presentations, and that's when we'll open up the floor to Q&A. So our first speaker today is Dr. Jason Fenno. Dr. Fenno has a keen interest in colonial dynamics of present-day policing in Canada. Through his PhD research, Dr. Fenno partnered with the Selkirk First Nation in relation to the Community Safety Officer program located in Pelly Crossing, Yukon. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Fenno.
Thank you so much for that introduction. My presentation today will be mainly focusing on the institution of policing here in Calgary and its roots in colonialism, to better understand the current state of the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the police here in Calgary, specifically with CPS, and how to better improve upon their current state of programs, initiatives to improve that relationship, but specifically rooted in a deeper understanding of the context of why policing was first utilized here within Calgary, rooted in the NWMP, and when it comes to CPS. So a little bit of background about myself. I'm a non-Indigenous ally scholar originally from the unceded interior Alaska, Tanana Athabaskan territory. I've lived on the territory of Nogaw-Jawananong for just about 8 years now with my wife as I finish up my PhD just this summer, and very much so keenly interested when it comes to better understanding the current state of policing within colonial context for elevating Indigenous people's voices, programs, initiatives within those programs, so to improve the outcomes for Indigenous peoples. So prior to my presentation, I want to quickly acknowledge, as a visitor here in this territory, I want to acknowledge the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprised of the Siska, Piikani, Piikani First Nations, as well as the Sutian First Nation, the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chukchi, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney First Nations. Also, I'd acknowledge the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3, this territory being encompassed by Treaty 7. Within this territory and my time within the territory as a visitor, honoring and paying respects, upholding all key aspects of each specific nation's protocols in terms of interacting with the land, the territory, language, and other types of specific teachings to uphold the respect as a visitor within this territory. So in terms of discussions of colonialism and policing, we've all discussed it throughout today and throughout the weekend. Today, when it comes to my talk, just discussing the institutional framework that really was built upon for the NWMP and for it indirectly for the CPS, the Calgary Police Service. I believe right now is very much so important for having these discussions to help to support reforms that CPS has been doing, as well as better elevating Indigenous people's voices, lived experiences with the police, and contextualizing it with the institution of colonial policing, of why policing was first instituted within this region here at Fort Calgary, and also indirectly influenced the formation of the Calgary Police Service. I believe right now also is crucially important due to what I would say the relationship between CPS and Indigenous peoples has fallen into a bit of a negative crisis state due to a number of negative, painful abuse of power incidents by CPS, which I will talk about in a moment. And I just want to warn everyone that I do discuss 3 of those specific incidents and 2 of those incidents where individuals lost their life at the hands of CPS, demonstrating a continued aspects of that replication of the colonial policing mindsets and viewpoints towards Indigenous peoples when it comes to the use of policing. So within those contexts, there's 3 incidents and 2 reports that I'll be discussing. And thinking about these, we'll get into an idea that time is now for understanding the roots of the policing dynamics here in Calgary, specifically related to the formation of the CPS and how it was also influenced by the Northwest Mounted Police. So you have 3 examples here, specifically very tragic examples at the hands of Calgary Police Service officers who have lost their lives or been inhumanely assaulted, as per the first piece there when it comes to Ace Big Child, who was assaulted at the hands of Calgary Police Service while being detained in a CPS facility. That assault left Big Child with very noticeable injuries, terrible amounts of pain and trauma that Big Child lives with to this day, as well as the tragic deaths of Goodstoney First Nation member Levin Fox in 2023. As a low-speed chase, CPS chose to use lethal force towards the individuals in the vehicle, including Fox. And the last individual, even more recently, indicating even more tragic aspects of how CPS interacts with and chooses to use force towards Indigenous peoples here in Calgary, was the tragic death of Blood Tribe member Jonathan Lee Wells in 2024, where 2 officers chose to use stun guns against Wells while he was dealing with a bit of a personal emergency situation that the officers chose to immediately use force towards this individual. So within these contexts of these 3 tragic incidents that we talked about today in terms of highlighting the concerning relationship between CPS and Indigenous peoples here today, there's also 2 reports that were published by the Police Commission here in Calgary that indicate further concerns with trust and ability to be able to interact in a positive way with CPS from Indigenous peoples who partook in this Police Commission survey, as well as individuals of color, Black community members, also indicating very concerning trends when it comes to CPS's use of force, trust, ability to go to CPS in times of need, which was also expanded upon in another report published by the Police Commission here in Calgary about the high rates of use of force against Indigenous peoples and individuals of color, Black males here in Calgary, which again, this isn't like a long time ago. This was reports published in 2020 indicating concerning trends when it comes to the use of force, the ability to interact in a peaceful, constructive, respectful manner when it comes to Indigenous peoples, as this is Indigenous lands here in Calgary. So CPS continues that negative trajectory in that relationship as they've tried to continue and improve. But in terms of today, I believe it's time to think about how the policing institution here in Calgary, when it comes to the NWMP, which we've talked about throughout the weekend, why it was formed. It wasn't just formed out of air. It was formed based upon a model known as colonial policing. So colonial policing is a model that the British Empire utilized across the empire to control and to secure their economic base across the empire in terms of whatever types of minerals they were exporting from out their lands when it came to stealing territory, these types of things that the British Empire carried out across their many colonies. They utilized the model known as colonial policing. First and foremost in Ireland, it was used and established in 1822. The Irish, Royal Irish Constabulary was established at that time and carried out brutal amounts of force and assaults on the Irish individuals trying to seek self-determination and freedom within those areas. As the British began that process of colonizing within Ireland, they established a force that would carry out their goals and means in the area. Now, there's a few methods of colonial policing that very much so define these elements of a colonial force versus a democratic police force that you think of when you think of a police force that's there to serve and protect, listen, provide a respectful, caring manner of responding to individuals who are in crisis, since when you're calling the police, it's usually not a positive day. You're usually looking for someone for compassion, looking for someone with respect and care. Colonial policing models were pretty much the opposite of that, of the institutions that were built upon here in Calgary. So that would be first and foremost being directly at the service of the civil power or the crown. So these police forces would be dispatched across the colonies, within the colonies that they worked upon in. And in Ireland, those would be putting down any kind of Irish revolts, utilizing as much force as needed. And the second piece there would be the amount of force that they utilized, which was being essentially a militaristic force that were trained in military tactics, using military weapons, being trained in a British cavalry tradition, and the like. So you can start to see that this kind of framework being utilized across the colonies was not by mistake. It was not utilized as a way to just kind of out of midair, as I said earlier, but it was clearly thought through. It was structured to focus on controlling, focus on upholding the rule of the Crown. And this was the institutional framework that the police services here, westernized centric police services of CPS, and now RCMP and other areas of Alberta, was framed upon. And I believe, as I'll talk about later on, continues in many different ways as that context isn't fully understood within the westernized institution of policing. The colonial policing structure was spread far and wide across the empire, as you see in this map here. Pretty much everywhere in red had some kind of form of a colonial policing model, or was influenced by colonial ideals of policing. So when it comes to Canada, moving back into the realm over here, into Calgary specifically, the colonial policing model, very much so first dispatched as Fort Calgary being established as one of the first main forts of the NWMP. You can see the list here, very much so mirroring a lot of those first aspects that we talked about a moment ago when it comes to what colonial police forces were established upon, focusing on controlling, focusing on making sure you are securing the economic base of the empire, focusing on carrying out very much so racist and colonialistic laws and ideals of what was to be when it came to how the empire asserted their sovereignty, and the protection of settlers and further aspects of the economic base when it came to the railroad. So this resulted in many negative outcomes that have been talked about throughout aspects of the weekend. The NWP utilized its authority in many different ways negatively. That would also go on indirectly to influence, and they worked with early CPS officers that I'll talk about in a moment when CPS was formed. The NWP carried out many negative, painful policies listed here on this slide, from the creation of the reserve system to the force upon the band council system, where there's stories from Ontario of communities having their longhouses broken into by RCMP officers and individuals jailed because they were not adhering to the colonialistic aspects of governance structures that the Crown and the Government of Canada wanted and was forcing upon Indigenous nations. Other programs that you see listed here are very much so thinking about, when you look through this slide, is the amount of power that the NWP was endowed with when it came to overseeing these amount of programs. And when you think about this specific area of Fort Calgary and in the prairies, there wasn't really much other government representatives. So as we heard about in our prior talk that was very wonderful and detailed, thinking about how much power that the NWMP held, not just carrying out policies, but also to arrest pretty much anyone that they felt, carry out any kind of jailing that they wanted. The NWP was the law and order. They were the representatives of the government in very far-flung areas, and even in other areas such as in the far north, the NWMP was provided with even further powers when it came to judge, when it came to carrying out mail, when it came to many other things. Another thing to note in the far north specifically, the E-TAG program was also administered by the NWP across the far north for decades, which was a very painful legacy across the north, which further expands the amount of power the NWMP had and present-day RCMP. Blurring the lines with the military, as has been discussed, NWP members fought in the Northwest Resistance as a full-on military force, which you see, we've touched upon the second piece of the definition of a colonial police force. And it's really interesting to note that many NWMP officers early on also asked to be dispatched to the Boer Wars in South Africa, which many of them were directly dispatched to the Boer Wars, and then they would come back and go back to policing. Right back into what they were doing before, which indicates a clear focus on that connection back to the militaristic ideals of how the NWMP was carrying out their work and goals, and what the institutions are policing, westernized policing, are built upon. Early Calgary here, when it comes to those connections, we've talked about it at length over the last few days. Fort Calgary being established in 1875, obviously it had a different name early on as Fort Brisbane. Would go on to be a very focal point of settler movement into the area, as settlers felt as though they would be protected, they would be safeguarded, as that was one of the key goals of the NWMP. It facilitated safe passage, and they did focus upon the whiskey trade and the rum runners at the beginning, which was positive, but quickly on, as we've mentioned throughout the weekend, the NWP would expand and really show their true colors as a colonial force of power and control towards Indigenous nations, Indigenous peoples, in terms of how they carried out many of those policies we've discussed early on. Calgary here at Fort Calgary, and in this specific building, which obviously has been rebuilt, would be expanded in 1882 as it would be a specific district post, and then the barracks would be constructed in 1898, the Dean House across the way in 1906, and it would further expand and be a precipice for supporting when it comes to settlers in the region, as other businesses and the like would be able to come out here and feel comfortable and feel safeguarded by the colonial force known as the NWMP. Now, moving back here in our micro kind of focus of Calgary, you think, oh, well, the Calgary Police Service wasn't formed as a colonial force. Why are we discussing this? But realistically, thinking about the time frame of when CPS was formed is very close to when the NWMP first came out here. As the CPS was formed in 1885, they shared a lot of the early duties with the NWMP in the area, so they were influenced aspects of their delivery and their work by early relationships with the NWMP indirectly at times, but also when it came to sharing those goals and those ideals of the day, the CPS would have been quite influenced, as there are aspects of influence to this day that have imagery that you can think about from early on in the prairies of the Northwest Mounted Police. That Calgary Police Service still continues to have a mounted police unit. They still wear a Stetson, obviously in a completely different structure, what have you, but the Stetson and the mounted police force, what kind of imagery, what does that send when it comes to you trying to improve your relationship with Indigenous nations and peoples where you've carried out many different types of abuses over many decades? CPS would go to expand in 1887, 1934 when it comes to having a formal police commission established. I also want to note CPS didn't establish a mounted police force in 1875 as more of like a loosely volunteer settler force of individuals who had horses that would kind of patrol on their own. The evolution, as I talked about a moment ago, CPS early on would be very much so controlled by council. So this meant that, are we feeling as though this almost is indirectly a colonialistic force of how council would direct early CPS officers to do their bidding for the wealthy and the well-connected? And you can think about how that might look and how that might negatively impact Indigenous nations and peoples even further in terms of how CPS was carrying out their duties in the early days of CPS being a standalone police force. As I mentioned, they would carry out and share duties with NWMP, carrying out discriminatory laws connected to the Indian Act. Here in Calgary, CPS would work with the NWMP and also on their own arrest individuals, Indigenous individuals, when it came to pool halls, when it came to trying to hire lawyers, when it came to these types of things that would have been potentially going on in more of like a urban, as we can think about very loosely using in those times of what Calgary would have looked like. CPS also supported early on NWMP and later RCMP in arresting individuals who would have been trying to partake in Sundance ceremonies, or individuals who may have been forcibly removed from their communities on the West Coast, maybe trying to reconnect with their traditions of the potlatch, which is obviously more of a traditional West Coast, traditional governance structural ceremony, but still then CPS working hand in hand with the NWMP and RCMP to carry out these colonialistic dynamics and policies. So moving back into today, in terms of what we talked about early on, in terms of those very painful aspects of abuse of power that CPS has carried out and continues to carry out at times, targeting Indigenous peoples and individuals of color here in Calgary. CPS in 2019 put forth a new plan for improving the relationship with Indigenous peoples, Indigenous nations here in Calgary, which has a number of very important key items listed here, which I would point to and say this is a great first step for CPS to begin that process of healing and doing more improvement in their listening than it is to when it comes to informing and telling individuals in those communities that are being marginalized how they're going to do things and how they'll improve. Other types of programs they've done in terms of partnering with the Sutini Nation Police Service, as well as the Calgary Indigenous Peoples Court, which are all positive, great movements towards improvements. But these programs were put in place and discussed in 2019. We're now in 2025, again, reminding ourselves of those abuse of power and those sad, tragic loss of life that did not need to happen just recently last year, and even more right around there as well in 2023 and 2022. So my suggestion would be CPS needs to do more listening and needs to contextualize those types of reforms and programs and initiatives in understanding what the institution of policing here in Calgary was built upon, which was on a dynamic control and taking land away, as well as carrying out colonialistic racist laws that target Indigenous nations, Indigenous peoples, as well as individuals of color. So there's two key pieces here is CPS needing to fully focus on in an institutional individual level of relationships. Before I came out here to kindly speak here at this gathering, I was moderating a Indigenous peoples online Canadian Council of Police Reform, and we had chiefs and individuals from across the country. And first and foremost, they focused upon the importance of relationships and needing police on an institutional and long-term level to focus on relationships and how this doesn't need to be a small thing to check a box, but this needs to be respectful, caring, contextualized understanding of why that's so important. As we've talked about today, the institution of policing, a westernized format, was built on disempowering Indigenous nations, Indigenous peoples, individuals of color, and why CPS, especially here in Calgary, due to the very painful legacy of policing, needs to reevaluate when it comes to education training, comes to cultural awareness training, and when it comes to funding and fully structuring their Indigenous mobilizers program as well, because there's been some concerns in terms of how that program has been supported over the long run for Indigenous peoples interacting with the police service here in Calgary. Now, my two last slides are focused on why understanding colonial policing matters here in Canada, but specifically here in Calgary. It matters because the largest institution of policing, the Colonial Police Force, that still works across Canada to this day, was built upon the framework of colonial policing, and it also indirectly informed the CPS. So it needs to be a full, wholehearted effort across the police service and the community to really understand and hold the police service accountable for better understanding and living up to the ideals of respecting and caring for the community, and within that context of the colonial dynamics that's sadly gone on in the past and continues to sadly go on at times to this day in not a direct colonial police force form, but as you see behind me listed here in militaristic forms where lots of police services choose to go towards a militaristic type of response quicker than you might think of when it comes to other portions of the community. And when we think about those two individuals who sadly lost their lives, police members who choose to go towards a lethal force or a less lethal force, like a stun gun, in those types of instances where you might want to have a discussion, might want to have more of an understanding of the deeper issues that might be going on that individuals need support than utilizing a stun gun or those types of things. And those types of incidents that we talked about do mirror aspects of those power and control by early colonial police forces that we talked about earlier when it comes to those individuals sadly losing their lives of control and the use of force when it comes to lethal force and stun guns. Now, the last piece I'll leave you with today is these two quotes from the First Nation member of the Calgary Police Commission, Marilyn North Pagan, who served on the Police Commission here in Calgary until 2022. Now, I've provided knowledge and uplifting these contexts of the colonial policing colonial policing framework here in Calgary, but also it's the words of elevating here I'll leave you with from Marilyn North Pagan. This open quote: especially here in Calgary area through policing, It is just a reflection of that the truth that the police were brought here to begin with, which is to take care of the quote-unquote Indian problem. And the second quote, open quote, we have to understand we're still dealing with the colonial system, which are based and rooted in the type of culture and mentality. So can we truly reform the systems that are built within that, with that in mind, or do we have to restructure the whole thing? This is the prime example of why we need to change the system entirely. This isn't trying to say the system needs to be taken down today, but it needs to say that within the context of a deeper understanding by CPS, the police service here, the main westernized police service, that there could be more acceptance of additional changes in the future that I would say need to support additional self-determination in the local First Nations and the Indigenous peoples in the area. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Fenno, and thank you also we're here to, commemorate a very specific local place, but also thanks for bringing those broader international and global settler colonial relations and police systems with us to this talk. Okay, next I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Gabriel and Karen Maracle. Dr. Maracle is a member of the Tyendinga Mohawk Territory. He is an assistant professor of political science at Carleton University in Ottawa, where his research focuses on Indigenous governance. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Maracle.
Hello, my name is Gabriel Maracle. Thank you for having me. You have an opportunity to speak at this wonderful event. This talk is going to be looking at how Indigenous masculinity is conceptualized, and more specifically, what programs and services have arisen to respond to and support Indigenous men. For a little bit of context, I was born and raised in that hive of scum and villainy known as Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. I apologize in advance. I am a status urban Indigenous, I'm a status Mohawk person. So my father is from Tyendinga Mohawk Territory, and my mother is non-Indigenous from a small town just in southern Ontario that is called Guelph, Ontario. So I completed my PhD in Indigenous Studies at Trent University last year. A little bit of behind the scenes finagling. Jason and I were in the same PhD cohort together. So it's a Trent Power Hour to wind things down for some reason. So I wanted to focus on this research for a couple of different reasons. There is not a lot of research that focuses on Indigenous men. There is a fairly significant gap in the literature and research when it comes to understanding how Indigenous forms of masculinity are expressed, how they're supported, what the impacts of colonization and colonialism have done to communities, which then in turn manifest themselves in different forms of masculinity. And there is a fairly significant gap in programming for Indigenous men. One of the things that I was interested in talking about and what kind of attracted me to this conference was this idea of looking at how policing and sort of Indigenous relations with policing has fundamentally reshaped communities all across the country. So I thought this was an opportunity to talk a little bit about the effects of that relationship between, Indigenous communities, Indigenous men, and policing and correctional services, but also kind of end on an upbeat note about talking about what's being done to address those needs. So this research was really focused on hoping to expand the understanding of what programs and services are available for Indigenous men. So this is coming from my research that I did as a PhD candidate. So I interviewed several people from 6 First Nations reserves in Ontario and Quebec. So all the communities were members of the Mohawk Nation. So we have 2 organizations from Tyendinga Mohawk Territory, my home community, 1 organization from Akwesasne Mohawk Territory, and 1 from Kanesatake Mohawk Territory. And then there was an opportunity to interview 6 different programs that are focused in urban spaces. And one of the cool connective links between my work and this research is one of the people that I worked with was a program director for the Alberta Native Friendship Center Association. So there are several friendship centers in Alberta, and I was able to speak with someone who worked at the provincial level, the provincial advocacy organization. So a lot of the work that is being done in terms of supporting Indigenous men are coming from either grassroots First Nations organizations or friendship centers and other urban Indigenous community-based organizations. So colonization has fundamentally reshaped men and masculinity, what it means to be a man, how masculinity is expressed, and how relations between genders function. Over the past 30, 40 years, there has been a lot of discourse and a lot of activism around creating spaces for people who identify as two-spirited within the context of Indigenous communities. That is a direct response to the overarching impacts of colonization that have happened in our communities. So one thing I always like to emphasize is that colonization is a process, it is ongoing, and it is modern. In my wallet, I have a documentation that states that I am legally an Indian. So even though that term might seem antiquated to people, it is still a modern term. It is still a term that fundamentally reshapes my relationship with the federal government and with the state. And colonization and colonialism has fundamentally reshaped Indigenous nations as a whole and fundamentally reshaped communities. One of the things I kind of like to think about when talking about colonialism is that colonialism is apocalyptic. It really is sort of the end of time for a lot of Indigenous nations. Our relationships with the lands were fundamentally changed. Our relationships with our communities have fundamentally changed. My people were originally from the Mohawk Valley in upstate New York, and due to the American Revolution, we had to decamp and move into Ontario. So even to a certain degree, like, we're settlers to Ontario. So it really speaks to how colonization and colonialism impacts many different levels of societies and many different levels of nations. So it destabilizes family, friends, and ourselves. And it effectively rewrote who we are. A kind of notable example that I like to emphasize when actually talking about community relations and particularly relationships when it comes to men and women you can kind of see from the Mohawk language. So, and not to terrorize anybody with grade 9 French, but Mohawk language is polysynthetic. So we have a prefix, suffix, and a noun. We squish it together, and then that'll be a concept, a sentence. And the feminine third person prefix is ionti, and that's feminine. And then the masculine third person prefix is roti. So if we have a group of people, and we're turning to French, if we have a group of people of mixed gender, how would you refer to that in French? What gender would that be? Masculine. In the Mohawk language, it's feminine, which kind of speaks to a little bit of like how at least Mohawk understandings of gender relations and sort of order and structure of power are related. Our nation is very, very matriarchal and matrilocal. We have a very, very strong presence of Mohawk women in our traditional governance structures, in community relations, to the point of fact where in traditional governance structures, if two people were to get married, it would be the husband that would move in with the wife's family. And it was predominantly the wife and the wife's brothers who were responsible for child rearing. We really were oriented towards having women in charge of effectively all of our governance structures. And that fundamentally changed due to colonization. The imposition of an inherently patriarchal system on our communities understandably would fundamentally reshape and kind of break what it means to be masculine, or would break what it means to be a man, and would fundamentally break what it means to be a woman. So that was one of the big things that all of those people that I interviewed talked about. was that there is this grand narrative and this grand system of colonization that has fundamentally reshaped how our communities relate to one another, and how what constitutes healthy masculinity express it, like how it fundamentally has been changed. And one point that a lot of the people that I spoke to noted is that when it comes to men reaching out for help, it's always after something's happened. It's always after an incident. It's always after, someone has not dealt with anger, and that comes and manifests itself in terms of spousal abuse or substance abuse or, road rage incidents and things like that. Men, when they do access help, it is always after an incident. So that really is a testament to how nefarious and how invasive colonization is to our communities, because traditionally, at least within the Haudenosaunee context, we have tons of healing and wellness ceremonies and programs that are designed to maintain stability and maintain healthy relationships, and our people aren't accessing them. And again, this is just a manifestation of colonization in our communities. And there is a very, very marked lack of supports for Indigenous men and Indigenous masculinity. I actually think this photo is kind of funny. So before I was coming to this talk, I wanted to make sure, because one of the people that I spoke to was the executive director of Name Res, Native Men's Residence. And he had said, in Canada, Name Res is the only program across the country that is a housing program dedicated to Indigenous men. Not just transitional housing, going from the streets into stable homes. They provide long-term housing. And I believed him, but I just wanted to double check my work. So I went into Google and I said, Indigenous men's housing in Canada. The results are, did you mean Indigenous women's housing in Canada? It's like, okay, point taken. So Google will back me up in saying that there isn't a lot of support for Indigenous men, in part because Indigenous men, not great at reaching out for help, in part because we have bought into this narrative of being the stoic Indian or not really being expressive. And the irony is that, we obviously experience expression, or we obviously experience emotions. It's just that a lot of them seal them up and let that pot simmer. And it's only until after there is an incident that it's like, oh, I actually do need to talk to somebody or provide some sort of support. And there is an overall lack of support. The most comprehensive support apparatus for Indigenous men come from two places: friendship centers or when you're in prison. Not great in the grand scheme of things. So as there are less supports for Indigenous men, there's less a supportive apparatus for Indigenous men. This leads to Indigenous men experiencing higher levels of interactions with police, experiencing higher levels of homelessness, experiencing higher levels of at least suicidal ideation. And the participants that I spoke to kind of highlighted a couple of different reasons as to why. One of them being that there is just generally a lack of funding for Indigenous specific programming. For anybody who works in Indigenous programming, Indigenous supports, Indigenous advocacy in any way, shape, or form, funding opportunities aren't super far and wide. It's a very, very small pool of money that we have to draw on in order to provide basic supports for Indigenous peoples, whether they are on or off reserve. And the supports that are available have been focused on Indigenous women and girls. Now, there is a very, very specific reason as to that. It's because Indigenous men have reaped the most rewards that come from colonization and patriarchy. So, colonization, the implementation of the ban system, has benefited Indigenous men the most. A really, really easy example is going back to where I'm from. So I'm originally from Ottawa. My dad is Indigenous. My mom is non-Indigenous. When my mom married my dad, again, she is non-Indigenous, she gained status. So according to the federal government, Both sides of my family are status, whereas my mom is one of the most waspy people you will ever meet. And up until 1985, if an Indigenous woman married a non-Indigenous man, she would lose her status. So as a result, there is a huge gap that has needed to be addressed when supporting Indigenous women and girls and two-spirited people. But as a consequence of that, because, the federal government not being too fun about spending money on Indigenous peoples, the supports for Indigenous men have fallen by the wayside. So there is a general consensus among people who deliver programming and services for Indigenous men and Indigenous women that we need more supports for Indigenous men. One of the positive things is that with the people that I spoke to is that masculinity can be a source of strength. Understanding and contextualizing masculinity, understanding and contextualizing Indigenous men within the context of being a part of a community or being a part of a nation is a very, very powerful form of support and healing and wellness. But it's critical that you don't approach things from the context of being a stereotypical, stoic Indian. This idea, and I believe it was talked about, someone made reference to it yesterday, where in at least the nations around here, they don't have the concept of a warrior, it's a guardian. I actually believe it was at the I'm getting, okay, perfect. So I am speaking correct. And that is a completely different context. Guardian versus warrior is something that really highlights how the stereotypical idea of an Indigenous person is that Indigenous man is that they're a noble warrior on the plains, whereas realistically, even if we were to use the term warrior, it was all really community-based. It was all rooted in ensuring that the community was protected, the family was protected, and our relationships with that community were protected. This quote from Joey Davis, who is one of the people that I interviewed who works in Akwesasne, said, when talking about working with Indigenous men, we try to adjust the men's issues from a historical perspective, especially with regards to generation and lateral violence. And this gets at one of the core concepts when talking about in programming for Indigenous men, but more broadly, talking about programming and supports for addressing colonization. A lot of the work that is being done is trying to just help people contextualize and historicize their own experiences. Over the past 20 years, there has been a marked improvement in the context of understanding the impacts of colonization or the impacts of residential schools. And I don't just mean this within the context of Indigenous communities, I mean this kind of collectively. I'm a teacher at a university. When I was in high school, I didn't even know that Indian residential schools were a thing. And now the kids that I'm working with, they have a pretty good understanding of what Indian residential schools are. So a lot of the teaching that comes from supporting Indigenous men is telling them this history of, we had a land base, we were nations, we had certain relationships between our communities, between our families, between our brothers and sisters. And even just kind of understanding that history is an incredibly powerful vehicle to support healing and wellness within Indigenous men. So on top of that, you have contextualizing the history of colonization as well as the history of Indigenous nations. But then there's also the idea of approaching it from Indigenous masculinity. Indigenous healing and wellness does not just come from an individual perspective. You are part of a community, whether you like it or not. You have people you can draw on for support. You have people you can talk to. You have people that are also going through similar healing and wellness programs that you can also rely on. Indigenous approaches to healing and wellness and Indigenous approaches to masculinity are all very community-based. No one operates within in a silo or in isolation. When it comes to healing and wellness, a lot of the people I spoke to emphasize that healing and wellness are not static. Sometimes you can have a good mental health day, sometimes you can have a bad mental health day. That's fine. The key idea is to emphasize that it is not something that you are either well or not. Again, you can have good days and you can have bad days. There's a quote from Naomi Adelson that I actually quite like that says, both healing and spirituality are potent and multi-layered concepts, textured as much by what people are healing from as to what they're healing towards. Healing and wellness and rehabilitation are journeys. They're long journeys, they're winding journeys, there are journeys that take detours. However, if a person can situate themselves within a community, situate themselves within a nation, situate them within themselves within being a series of relationships, then that will help and promote healing, and that radiates outwards. Because if someone who is 5 years sober, working with elders, that might attract someone who is maybe 2 weeks sober, and that they can rely on a series of relationships to help and promote healing. What's interesting, and what a lot of the people I talk to emphasize, is that Indigenous approaches to healing as being recognized as being acceptable is still a relatively new thing. Realistically, Indigenous approaches to rehabilitation, to healing and wellness, to in the inclusion of ceremonies, the inclusion of Indigenous knowledge, within the context of mainstream therapeutic processes, is only about 25 years old. I'm older than those concepts, and I don't think I'm that old. So even though there are a lot of holistic processes, there are a lot of concepts and ideas that are grounded in Indigenous knowledge that have existed for thousands upon thousands of years, it has only really been in the past 25 years that those knowledges and those approaches have been able to occupy a space in mainstream therapeutic practices. So it is something that is still relatively new. In the same way that talking about needs for Indigenous men, Indigenous and helping support Indigenous masculinity is still a relatively new idea. So one of the other things that was emphasized that I spoke about a little bit was this need for community supports. Again, healing does not operate within isolation. So community supports are critical, whether they are formal or informal. You can go to a friendship center, you can go to an Aboriginal Health Access Center to get proper programming, or if you know somebody that hosts traditional sweats, you can also access healing through there. There are numerous overlapping networks that exist on one another that provide support, that can provide support for Indigenous men. But it has to be rooted in the values and ethics of a nation. Pan-Indigenous approaches really don't work anymore. This isn't the mid-90s. We need to ensure that nations are able to provide nation-specific healing and wellness supports for their citizens and for people that operate on their territory. One of the weird things I found is that COVID-19 did change delivery service, but not necessarily for the worst. So beforehand, in order to access healing and wellness programs, you'd have to show up in person or you'd have to phone somebody. Whereas now, a lot of the stuff is done over Zoom, and a lot of people are able to access health and wellness services through texting. I'm a big texter, so I was like, that is awesome. I'm kind of awkward on the phone, if you can't tell. And it's also important to have Indigenous-specific spaces that are dedicated to just hanging out. Sometimes you don't really want to do a lot of heavy lifting. One of the appealing things about something like a friendship center is that you can just kind of show up, have a cup of coffee, chat with somebody, kind of talk about the day, talk about sports, how the Blue Jays are doing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that does help embed somebody within a community, even though they're not specifically there to access some sort of programming or service. And these organizations, these Indigenous-led organizations, are important because it also reflects the values of the nation. A lot of mainstream Western therapeutic practices are very, very hierarchical, and they don't look at things within a holistic manner, whereas Indigenous approaches to healing and wellness do. Wayne Montague from Georgian Bay Friendship Center said, "There are unfortunate hierarchical structures that doesn't support the holistic growth. In that hierarchical structure, our approach is not measurable. It has to be 1, 2, 3, 4. In our holistic systems, there's not even numbers." So sometimes having a structured and organized program can work well for people. In other instances, it kind of has to be based on what the elder or the program person views as being the most supportive for Indigenous men who are working through the system. And there are marked differences between the urban and reserve context. So the urban and reserve both have their own unique challenges. When it comes to urban-based programs and supports, a lot of time accessing land or land-based programming is a hurdle because, taking a bus out to a national park, that costs money. Organizing trips costs money. Ensuring that you have access to any sort of green space costs money. Whereas in the reserve context, you're working within your own community-based context and all that stuff. However, anybody who is from a reserve or is from a small town knows everybody knows everybody's business. So there is a lack of anonymity that comes with trying to access programs and supports on reserve. So if someone was hesitant about accessing healing and wellness programs within a reserve context, they're going to be even more so because it might be that the person at the front desk who's signing them in is their cousin. So regardless of, what's interesting is that regardless of where the programs and supports are based, a lot of it is multinational. My home community of Tyne-Tenega has a Mohawk-based healing and wellness program, but they support people who are Anishinaabe, they support people who are Cree, they support Indigenous people who are just in the region. So even though they can be rooted in communities, they can help people who are not necessarily from that traditional territory. So regardless of where the programs or supports are based, they have to be rooted in Indigenous knowledges and Indigenous perspectives. I will say that urban spaces rely more heavily on program and service delivery just because there is a great deal more diversity within urban spaces. Also, in general, there isn't a dedicated neighborhood that is specifically just for Blackfoot or Haudenosaunee or Cree. When it comes to accessing program and services on reserves, there is also still quite a bit of stigma when it comes to seeking out mental health supports, for men or women. One of the big things that was emphasized across all of my participants, all the research, is that it is critical to center Indigenous knowledge. That includes languages, ceremonies, knowledges, teachings. So approaching things from a very, very holistic understanding of what it means to be Indigenous and how Indigenous knowledge can promote healing. This is a quote from Holly Brandt, who is from my home community. She said, "I think one of the keys to that program, which was a men's program, is that we have traditional practitioners as one of the people who are involved with delivering information. It's not just a matter of having a dedicated counselor. It's a matter of having elders and knowledge keepers within these systems to ensure that people are accessing the counseling that they need to, as well as understanding who they are and the connections they have to the broader community." So in conclusion, healing is a process. So again, emphasizing this idea that healing is something that is collaborative and is something that happens on a day-to-day basis. And it's important to emphasize that Indigenous knowledge is central to supporting Indigenous men. And again, even though there is a general lack of supports for Indigenous men when it comes to healing and wellness, I am actually quite optimistic because more and more communities are trying to get something off the ground. So if I'm not mistaken, that is it. Nyawakoa.
Thank you, Dr. Gabriel Maracle. When we were organizing and reading the proposals, we thought it would be valuable to have a Mohawk perspective in these conversations with us, so thank you for being here. So questions, and please put your hand up so that a mic can get to you. I see a mic over here.
My question has to do with the expansion of policing in cities. So for example, we've seen the expansions of CPS going into peace officers. So we have transit peace officers, we have bylaw officers, and their interaction with both Indigenous and other vulnerable populations. So as an organization, what kind of encouragement or what do you see organizations can do to make themselves be more successful and move away from this colonial policing approach? And then the second question, sorry, it is related, I swear, is I wrote it down. Do you think that the Colonial Police Force, that mentality is still infiltrated into those like peace officer roles?
No, I think those are two great questions. In terms of your first question, when it comes to the expansion of like urban police services to bylaw, to other types of kind of delivery of police services, I think the key when it comes to thinking about it is there's no one-size-fits-all solution for all like urban centers across Canada, but specifically here in Calgary, it's very much so endowed with listening to those specific communities, Indigenous peoples, minority populations, when it comes to improving these relationships, but also if there is alternatives, if there needs to be alternatives, if communities have ideals for alternatives that work better to support, as Gabe was talking about, different types of healing programs, support programs that could be better suited to being called in times of crisis, where police aren't a positive source for help. Where you saw those individuals I talked about during my talk, individuals dealing with crisis or dealing with different types of things in their lives, that those officers, who knows what they've dealt with in their own lives, maybe they're doing what they've been trained, what have you, but at the same time, the results are the results. We have individuals who've lost their lives, so I think there needs to be more consultation clearly focused on if there could be an alternative, if First Nation community, Inuit, Métis in the region have alternatives that need to be fully supported when it comes to a self-determined approach, maybe working in a partnership type model or something of that matter, as urban spaces are very complex, as Gabe talked about. So looking at partnering with maybe friendship centers to help to support how those potential urban delivery models could work, but those are all up to listening to First Nations peoples, Inuit, Métis, minority populations in terms of how alternative models could be structured to better suit and better meet the needs of individuals in the community that doesn't utilize the form of lethal force, less lethal force, and these types of things, because it results in very painful outcomes, as was addressed in the talk. And you see that institutional knowledge within policing structures and urban spaces is very similar to those institutional knowledge of how the NWP was structured, but also giving a normalized approach to how that abuse of power is utilized across policing institutions at different times, I think also sends a signal that, okay, this is a normalized type of behavior. So always trying to think about and listening to supporting self-determination of nations when it comes to differentiated approaches, and then in urban settings looking towards some kind of alternative support in terms of friendship centers, working out of those types of spaces, or whatever have you when it comes to local Indigenous peoples, having alternatives that need to be supported, need to be listened to. And then your second question, sorry. Well, yeah, I mean, I think it differentiates between different police services, but I think just from looking at the state of the environment here in Calgary, and the institutional knowledge of how the police institutions began, and working in a structure of policing. So structures of policing, peace officers, bylaw officers, all work under that umbrella of being general officers, if you will. And they work with each other at times. They have discussions with each other. It gets into a police culture. What is the police culture? How do we break down that culture of policing? I think it would be to try and disassociate from having more individuals that are looking like they're in uniform, almost harkening back to those days of early days of NWMP, early days of police forces, and even present day of police forces that continue to carry out violence and abuse. So I think, again, looking towards alternatives, looking for more community support, as Gabe talked about in his piece, as alternatives to having more officers out on the street, and looking towards also more partnerships for those police services, so you don't see bylaw officers and those individuals feeling as though, oh, maybe I have to make a decision, or I don't really have the training, I don't really understand, don't really have that context to maybe what's going on, to maybe approach a situation differently.
I am wondering about the role of police and the discretion of police, and the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in the justice system. And the research shows that the police, as the first point of contact with, potentially a criminal event, that the research is showing that there are generally more charges for Indigenous people, and those charges are more serious, which of course makes it put some people behind the 8 ball when it comes to plea bargaining and whatnot. So what recommendations would you have for that situation?
So again, I think that's a great question, and highlighting the importance of that first point of contact with police in the justice system, and the power that police have even to this day, have so much power that harkens back to, like we talked about with colonial institutions, with the NWMP having so much power to take people's freedom away, to charge people with excessive amounts of charges, to view Indigenous peoples as being more violent, if you will, in these stereotypical ways that police services do at times. So I think, again, I don't think it's me to have those answers or things like that. I'm just here to point towards, again, I think listening towards community and thinking towards how to re-educate those officers, as I talked about at the end, and thinking about training and thinking about more improvements when it comes to partnerships, so those officers don't get to that point. And maybe there doesn't have to be interaction with an officer there who knows what their own interaction with their own background is. But like you mentioned there, the rates of Indigenous individuals, especially Indigenous women right now across the country, being incarcerated are at the highest points that they've ever been. So it indicates a point that where is the first point of contact with the justice system? Usually it's policing. And within the context of how policing was first formalized within that colonial context, think about how can we limit those interactions or lessen the amount of interactions that those individuals may have to have. If there's other services that may be able to turn to, services that community feels as though that haven't been supported or haven't been fully funded at this time, maybe reevaluating how the FNIPP is funding, the funding structures to fund alternatives to those types of structures. So those types of systems where you have officers like you're talking about are charging individuals with excessive amounts of charges, doesn't get to that point. When we get all the way to the point where an officer has so much discretion, as you're talking about, to charge someone with 1 offense, 2 offense, 3 offense, oh, you made a look at me or whatever, here's another offense. So thinking about how can we de-escalate those kind of situations to the point where there's more of a clear understanding that officer can go into that situation and say, okay, I have additional training, I have partners that I can work with, that we can look towards maybe providing more supports in these types of situations. So again, it doesn't hopefully get to that point. And then also hopefully showing to those police services that you're working in a nation-nation relationship, that these alternative programs that Gabe was talking about, types of healing programs, urban programs, are looked at as not just kind of specialized programs, but these are programs that are put on by Indigenous nations to be respected and partnered with in a respectful manner, that aren't to be, oh, well, maybe we'll call them, I don't know, And so it thinks of it in terms of these are fortified structures to provide alternatives for de-escalating and then moving in more community partners, more alternatives for those individuals to respond. So it doesn't get to the point like you're talking about, which is such a great point, of how officers and individuals, Indigenous individuals, are getting charged with much more higher rates, and then you see high rates within the prison population, as Gabe talked about.
And one final question.
I have 2 questions. One is when it comes to CPS, they typically don't have a First Nations, Métis, or Innu person on the commission. Would it make a difference having a dedicated 100% person guaranteed that is the First Nations, Métis, or Inuit on the commission's board? Number 2. We have tried, I'm the district captain for Calgary Métis District, we have tried to implement like a men's circle, just so men can come in, have a chat, have a talk, do whatever they want to do, free to just talk about anything they want. One person signed up. How do we get our citizens to know about it and feel comfortable in actually going? Because as you know, men do not like to open up and talk about their feelings. They're very stoic.
I'll jump on that second question first. My dad worked as a prison elder for about 25 years in central and eastern Ontario. And obviously prison, not a great place to access like healing and wellness services. But one of the things that he talked about was that a lot of the best teaching or the best outreach he was able to do with people was to, for lack of a better word, like smuggle in healing and wellness through like stories and things like that. So if men are not great at accessing programs and services for like mental health and things like that, you know, if there's an advertisement that's like, come speak about your emotions in a small dedicated room, that's obviously going to like scare people away. However, at least in the Ontario context, and with the Kize Anishinabeg program, which is the I Am a Kind Man program, a lot of the program and services is, you know, yeah, there's talking about healing, wellness, and rehabilitation, but a lot of it is like, come learn how to like bang on the big drum, or come learn how to make moccasins. Part of it is like tricking men into doing supports, and then, you know, if they're consistent 6 months later, they're like, oh man, this is actually really helping promote mental health. So you kind of have to like trap them, is the best way I would put it.
And then in terms of your first piece of your question, I would say yes, there should be dedicated seats within the commission, First Nation, Inuit, Métis representation. I would also go a step further and say the commission is great, they do great work, but also having, as some of the items I pointed out, CPS truly dedicating to a long-term relationship reform on the institutional and individual level. Institutional level, I would say having a dedicated space for some kind of structure of Indigenous Police Commission, where there could be clear representation, full representation of Indigenous peoples to provide full feedback on whatever types of policies, programs, or maybe alternatives that are going on in the community that could be partnered with, could be supported, because I think it's really important to have that perspective on a long-term basis when it comes to meeting, when it comes to hearing those perspectives in the community, because as we know, police services maybe always don't want to change when it comes to those types of things. So having a clear space where Indigenous peoples can be represented, and then hold the CPS to account when it comes to changes, when it comes to partnerships, when it comes to what have you is going on in the community. The police commission, I think, is great, but I think there would need to be also in a long-term space for Indigenous peoples, First Nation, Inuit, Métis, to provide their clear feedback on a regular basis, and also just to meet, just to have those discussions in relationship, because it's not always easy to have those relationships with police services that have done so much harm for so many decades and sadly continue in a modern space. So I think it's just really important to have those relationships, meeting in friendship centers, meeting in organizations within the urban space, I think are really important, in making sure that those are clearly respected and a constant from the police services end.
Thank you, Dr. Maracle. I can't help but think about the parallels between Jody Wilson-Raybould's talk about the unseen labor of her grandmother in preserving culture, and there's work that needs to be done on that too. Please join me in thanking our speakers again.